Hi, I'm Derek Pratt, and this is a YouTube version of the talk I gave at the Cape Town Family History Society meeting on Saturday the 18th of June 2022. I hope you enjoy this YouTube version. Like all genealogists, I presume that my friends are as interested in family history as I am. Many years ago, after telling a close friend about the recent families I'd researched and the little scandals, black sheep and skeletons one finds, she suggested that I research the, quote, juicy scandal of a divorce in her family. The divorce was her great-grandparents in 1895. I rose to the challenge and, sure enough, found a fascinating divorce case which certainly had elements of sadness, yet it was a juicy scandal, as she said. But what was more fascinating was what I found out about the characters after the divorce. Besides the official court records at the Cape Archives, I also found via Google a lengthy entry in the, quote, report of all court cases decided in the Supreme Court of the Cape of Good Hope, January to June 1895, as reported by J.D. Shiel and published by the Cape Times. Here's a brief transcript of this case. Just a warning, the lawyer's questions are not recorded in this report, only the witness's response, so one has to imagine the questions being asked. Supreme Court, before Sir J.H. de Villiers, Chief Justice, Mr. Justice Buchanan and Mr. Justice Uppington. Rudd versus Rudd, 3rd of May, 1895. This was an action for divorce brought against Edward Augustus Rudd of Oudtshoorn by his wife for a decree of divorce on the ground of adultery. Mr. Maltino appeared for the plaintiff, the defendant in person. In other words, Edward Rudd was going to defend himself. Mr. Norman Lacey, who I later discovered was a clerk in the Colonial Secretary's office, produced the marriage register. The defendant admitted the marriage. Mrs. Jacomina Jacina Rudd of Oudtshoorn, the plaintiff, said she was married to the defendant in 1881. There had been 8 children, 6 of whom were still alive, all minors. Just to mention, my friend's grandfather was the youngest child born 7 months previously in November 1894. At the latter end of 1894, her husband was often away from Oudtshoorn. He first went to Cape Town in July and returned in a short time, then left again and remained till about the end of September. He was also away in November and January. They were married in community of property. She brought into community £600 and a life interest, with certain property inherited from her father. The defendant was now insolvent. The plaintiff, continuing, said she intended to make a living by taking in boarders. Her mother was going to help her by building a house for her at Oudtshoorn. This is the house as it is today in Rudd Lane in Oudtshoorn. It is now used by the Department of Social Services. The plaintiff wished for custody of the children. Cross-examined by the defendant himself, last year defendant was not very kind to her children. He had to ask for her forgiveness. He had acted unkindly to her mother, and he said he did love the children except the eldest. He had never beaten or ill-treated the children. She did not think by bringing that action she had acted hastily. Why had he spent money so lavishly? She would have sued for divorce after hearing of his actions, whether her mother had spoken to her or not. The next witness was Edward Foley, who said he kept a boarding house in Loop Street. Actually, the archive file says Long Street, but no number is given. About October 1894, the defendant came to his house with a woman he knew named Mrs. Polly Farrance. She'd been a servant at Claridge's Hotel. The defendant came and said the woman was his nurse and had to attend him as he was ill. He hired a room in which was one bed. He said he was unable to sleep at night and the woman had to look after him. He had no suspicions at first, but one morning about 8:30 he happened accidentally to go into the room and he saw them lying in bed together. He turned the defendant out of the house at once. The woman had no money and nowhere to go, and she was retained as a servant by Mr. Foley. She was now in the Free State. Once again, just a note, I found no further records for Polly Farrance in the Free State or anywhere in South Africa. The next time Foley saw Rudd was late one night when, from what he had heard from a servant, he went to the room of a woman, Miss Frances Dick, who had just come from England, and found Rudd lying on one of the beds in the room. The woman had lodged at his house a week. She did not work, only drank. When he got to the room, he found the door locked, and when he knocked, the light was blown out. He asked the woman if anyone was in the room with her. She replied, no. He demanded admission. She said she was undressed and in bed. He said she must dress and admit him. He waited 10 or 15 minutes and was then allowed into the room and found Rudd lying dressed on a bed. Cross-examined. Foley denied having used any inducement to get the defendant to come and live at his house with either of the women. Defendant had admitted adultery to him with Mrs. Farrance. He said he was not guilty with respect to Miss Dick. Walter Osmond Hanson corroborated the last witness with respect to seeing the defendant in Miss Dick's room, lying on one of the beds. The date was a little after Christmas. The defendant expressed himself desirous of giving evidence, but the Chief Justice said he could scarcely advise him to do so, and the defendant withdrew his request and simply asked that he might at all reasonable times be allowed to see his children, of whom he was still very fond. The Chief Justice said sufficient proof of adultery had been given. A decree of divorce with costs is granted. Plaintiff to have the custody of the children, the defendant to have access to them at all reasonable times and places. So to summarize then, we find Edward Augustus Rudd travelling regularly from Oudtshoorn to Cape Town on business, and using his time away from home to enjoy some after-hour recreation. Besides Mrs. Polly Farrance, whose further details, as I said, I couldn't find, there was a Miss Frances Dick. The archived divorce file also tells of a private detective, a Alfred William Loader, who followed Edward Augustus and chatted to him at Cape Town Station and heard he was planning to skip the country on the Donotta Castle with his wife's jewels. The private detective managed to get a writ to have Edward Rudd arrested before the mail boat sailed. After the divorce was granted, Mr. Rudd did go to England, but I could not find him in any of the passenger lists from the Cape. So let's just look at the cast of characters in South Africa, the names I've mentioned so far. First of all is Edward Augustus Rudd. He was the son of Thomas Rudd and Matilda Turpin. Thomas Rudd was the chief clerk at the Union Bank. Matilda Turpin, the Turpin family were part of the 1820 settlers who had settled in Salem. The father was a teacher, and he actually moved to Cape Town because he got a job later as teaching in the Cape Corps. Jacomina Josina Rudd, his first wife, daughter of Herman van der Veen and Christine Marnitz. Christina van der Veen, born Marnitz, granddaughter of Philip Willem Marnitz. Now, Philip Marnitz was in fact a lieutenant in the artillery at the Battle of Muizenberg, and he wrote a book attacking the bad defence put up by the other VOC officers in the battle. Though lately I've seen some modern historians are now attacking this point of view taken by Philip Marnitz. Frances Dick is the fourth character, became Edward Rudd's second wife, and is the lady of the mysterious background that we are investigating this afternoon. Then there were 4 minor characters. The first, Edward Foley, he was owner of a restaurant and lodging house in Long Street. He died a year later in 1897. His wife continued to run the lodging house until she died in 1903. Polly Tarrance was a hotel maid. As I said, I found nothing on her. Walter Osman Hansen was lodging as a guest in the hotel and was witness to Augustus Rudd's adultery. And then Alfred William Loder is a private detective employed by Mrs. Rudd to find out what her husband was doing in Cape Town. On the 9th of February 1897, I found that Edward Augustus Rudd married a Frances Mary Lily Dick in the Pancras Registry Office in London. In many respects, this seems to be an honourable solution arising from the divorce proceedings, where the defendant marries the person with whom he is accused of having committed adultery, even if he denied it in court. 4 years later, the 1901 census took place, and I duly searched for and found an Edward Rudd born in the Cape Colony, living in Southampton with his wife, now named Emily, who the census record says was born in Bath, Somerset. It would appear that this is the right Edward Augustus Rudd, but there's a few problems. The first is Edward's profession, Inspector of Sheets for the LSW, which is the London South West Railway. Later in 1901, when their daughter was born and is registered by his wife, she describes his occupation as a dock labourer. And certainly this appears to be a more accurate description of him, as a few years later he was injured while unloading a ship in Southampton Dock. But the biggest question mark is, who is Emily? And where is Frances Dick? And so the mystery starts. In the same year, 1901, a child was born to Edward Augustus Rudd and his wife Emily. I ordered the birth certificate and found this mother of the child is given as Emily Beatrice Rudd, maiden name Dick. So my thoughts at this point was that she changed her Christian name from Frances Mary Lily to Emily Beatrice. I searched the birth registrations for a Frances Mary or Beatrice Emily Dick, born in Bath, or in fact anywhere in Somerset, but still found nothing. I then searched the 1911 census records for this family and found the following. Notice she's still calling herself Emily, and she's still born in Bath. So who actually is this woman? Where was she born? At that time of my 10-year-long search, the next census type record available was the 1939 register, and it complicated the story slightly. Same address, as you can see, same name, but notice that Edward Rudd now says he's widowed, and Emily, that's the W by the way in that column, and Emily Rudd is listed as being single. I presume this was perhaps a mistake by the people collecting the data. Perhaps they just didn't believe that there was a 10-year gap between wife and husband. Or were Edward and Emily trying to hide something? Who was this mysterious lady? Frances or Emily Rudd, born Dick? I could find no definitive birth records. Was she perhaps born overseas? But why does she constantly say she was born in Bath, Somerset? Now, as we all know, on the 6th of January 2022, the 1921 census was released. I duly purchased a digital image of their entry. Same address, 3 Dyer Road, Fremantle, Southampton. Ages differing from previous census records, as they seem to do all along, but the biggest difference was the place of birth of Emily Rudd, previously Dick. Bath has now become, more specifically, Radstock, Somerset. I searched for Dick in Radstock. which fell under the General Registration Office district of Clutton, Somerset, but found no Dick there at all. I wondered if she'd been married before, or perhaps had a history that she was trying to keep hidden. And so I turned to the British newspaper collection, which you can find on www.findmypast.co.uk. This database is mainly local papers from around the UK. I entered Francis Dick, and some very interesting stuff came up. Firstly, there was a graduation of the Royal University Medical Faculty in May 1891. The version I'm reading from is The Queen, published on the 30th of May 1891. The ceremony of conferring the degree gained at the spring examinations of the Royal University took place on the 31st of last month at the University Building, Earlfort Terrace, Dublin. In the degree of M.B., the exhibition of £25 was awarded to Miss Hester Russell, London School of Medicine for Women, who also gained the only second-class honours. Miss Anna I. Church took first place in the upper pass division. Miss Frances L. Dick passed favourably. In the second examination in medicine, one of the exhibition's awards was won by Miss Emily Dixon, who gained second-class honours. Miss Anna Haley received the degree B.A. Lord Emley presided, and considerable enthusiasm prevailed when the candidates, particularly the lady students, came forward to receive their honours. And so we have a woman with the name Frances L. Dick, who had graduated as a doctor in Dublin. Now, in my many searches for a Frances Dick, one had come up in London in 1891 census. This Frances Dick's occupation is given as general practitioner, and next to this someone has penciled in surgeon. And Frances Dick's place of birth is given as Sydney, New South Wales. And because of that, I dismissed this, as it really didn't fit the bill of the lady who married Edward Augustus Rudd. But the next few newspaper articles I found had me reassessing the situation. From the Evening News, London, 28th of November 1896. Lady Doctor's difficulty. She could not find her lodging and was fined for drunkenness. Among the prisoners before Mr. Curtis Bennett at Marylebone was a tall female of masculine appearance, wearing a grey costume of straw hat, who was described on the charge sheet as Frances Dick, aged 30, a lady doctor, residing at Manchester Street, Manchester Square. Just keep in mind that mention of a tall female of masculine appearance. Constable Munsey, 143D, deposed that at 1:15 in the morning he found the accused at the door of various houses in Manchester Street, very drunk, and knocking at the door of various houses. He asked her who she wanted, and she replied that she was trying to find two maiden ladies with whom she lodged. Knowing where she had been lodging, the witness directed her to go, but she persisted in knocking at the doors, so he took her into custody. At the police station she denied a charge of drunkenness, which was preferred against her, and a doctor was called in. He pronounced her intoxicated. Magistrate: What is she? Police officer: She says she is a doctor. The accused: I admit everything. Magistrate: You denied everything last night. You'll have to pay 10 shillings or 7 days. So, briefly, to summarise, a Frances Dick from Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, passes her degree at an Irish medical school and had some 5 years later, in 1896, been arrested for being drunk and disorderly on the streets of Marylebone in London. Was this the Frances Dick who was in that hotel room in Long Street in Cape Town? Was she perhaps an Australian medical doctor who stopped in Cape Town on her way home? Or perhaps coming from Sydney on her way back to the UK? I needed to find out more about this lady doctor. Now, women doctors were few and far between in the 1890s, so I was sure she might be well known, especially in Australia. And a Google search produced a brief biography as well as a picture. On the back of this picture is written, Dr. Francis Dick was born between 1866 and 1870. Dr. Francis Dick graduated from the London School of Medicine for Women and the University of Ireland. She was not a graduate of Sydney University, as written in pencil on the back of this photograph. Her qualifications included LSA, which stands for the Licentiate of the Society of Apothecaries, 1891, and MB, BA Surgeon, Royal University of Ireland. Appears in the 1891 census of England and Wales as boarding with James Main and family in Marylebone, London. 1892, she was the first woman to practice medicine in New South Wales, preceding Dr. M.A. Corliss by a few months. She was registered on the 13th of January 1892. 1893, practiced as a surgeon at 195 Elizabeth Street, Sydney. Left from Sydney for Germany on the Gulf of Genoa on the 18th of December 1899. Also written in the biography, it says, Dame Mary Gilmore describes her: when everyone else was dressed in floral or other soft materials, Dr. Dick wore tailor-made tweeds as like a man's, without aping a man as possible. It is thought she later went to Germany to become a specialist, where she died. According to Loxton's Medical Dictionary of Australia in 1900, Dr. Dick is not listed. The photograph was taken in 1892 by a J. Hubert Newman at 12 Oxford Street, Sydney, and it is held by the State Library of New South Wales. Now, the dates of birth of Dr. Francis Dick of Sydney fits Edward Augustus Rudd's wife's date of birth, especially as the two of them kept on changing their dates of birth and different census records and so on. However, from this biography it would appear that she went to Australia in 1892 and remained there until she left for Germany in 1899. Using the Trove website of Australian newspapers, by the way, if you need to look up Australian stuff, it's a wonderful resource. I found that Dr. Francis Dick is mentioned copiously on the social pages of the newspaper in Sydney between the years of 1892 and 1893, when, and together with Miss Alice Josephson, she left on the Victoria for Europe. In 1894, the press quoted from a private letter from her in the social columns, again, describing her work in Viennese hospitals. No other mentions are found in the newspapers from that point onwards. So, she could have been around London in 1896 when Dr. Francis Dick was arrested for being intoxicated. However, I started to wonder if there was someone in London who had stolen Dr. Francis Dick's identity. I looked through some more of the British newspaper database entries for Dr. Francis Dick, when two more articles came up which were absolutely fascinating. They both appeared in the Reynolds newspaper, and that's the version I'm going to read now, though not necessarily the one I'm going to show on the screen. The first appeared on the 25th of April, 1897. A mysterious traveller. At Croydon on Monday, a woman of ladylike appearance, giving her name as Mary Smith, 30, of no fixed abode, was charged with obtaining food and lodging to the amount of £1 4s. 7d, with intent to cheat and defraud. Mr. Sidney Pease, the landlord of the Greyhound Hotel, Croydon, said that on Thursday evening the prisoner called and asked for a double-bedded room, representing that she had walked from Brighton and that her husband was following on a bicycle. She gave the name of Mrs. Edward Rudd. Her husband did not arrive, and the prisoner, who seemed somewhat anxious, said she supposed he'd been detained on the road. On the following morning, the prisoner asked for a telegraph form and dispatched a message telling the chambermaid it was addressed to her husband. On Friday afternoon, a man named Wilton arrived and stayed a quarter of an hour. On Saturday morning, the witness presented a bill which amounted to £1 4s. 7d. Prisoner said she had no money, and he would have to wait until her husband's arrival. Getting suspicious, he gave her into custody. The prisoner said Mr. Pease was extremely insulting to her, and quite unnecessarily so, and that was why she refused him information. She had never been in such a predicament before. The statement that he had presented, that she had walked from Brighton in a day, was untrue. It would have been impossible to her to have done that. She had only come from Grinstead. Mr. Pease added that the prisoner subsequently gave her name and address as one Dr. Smith of 165 Clapham Road, but he failed to verify the same in the London directory. At the police station, she called him aside and gave the name Sir Saul Samuel, Agent General for New South Wales in Victoria Street, London, declaring that she was registered as Dr. Francis Dick. Witness telegraphed there, and as nobody happened to be in the office, he wired Sir Samuel's private address, receiving the telegram produced in reply. The message was handed to the prisoner, who, after perusing it, said, "It's quite right. It's 3 years since I saw him." The case was adjourned for a week. The magistrate offered to accept bail in one surety of £5 and prisoner in a similar sum. I can only guess that this is our Mrs. Rudd, and she being assuming the identity of Dr. Francis Dick. She had only married Edward Rudd on the 9th of February 1897, and here she is appearing in court within 3 months of getting married. The adjourned case was heard on the 2nd of May 1897. Once again, I'm reading the article from Reynolds newspaper. Before the Croydon Borough Magistrate on Monday, Mary Smith, 30, who was attired in a yachting costume, was charged on remand with obtaining food and lodging to the value of £1 4s. 7d by false pretence from Sidney Pease, landlord of the Greyhound Hotel. Mr. Pease repeated the evidence he gave at the first hearing, to the effect that the prisoner gave the name of Mrs. Edward Rudd, and that she was registered at the office of the Agent General for New South Wales as Dr. Francis Dick. But for her statement, seeing that she had no luggage, he would have asked for a deposit. The prisoner's husband, who was said to be a South African barrister, stated that he did not wish to give evidence. His position was a very painful one. Further evidence was then called. Mrs. Susan Preston, labour mistress at the Cuckfield Workhouse, stated on the 12th of last month the prisoner applied for admission to the casual ward and stayed there until the morning of the 14th. She performed the usual tasks of labour and gave the name of Mary Smith. Henry Mitchell, porter of the East Grinstead Workhouse, deposed that on the night of the 14th he admitted the prisoner to the casual ward, and she took her discharge the next morning. Mrs. Margaret Cotterill, lodging house keeper of Lavender Street, Brighton, said the prisoner came to lodge with her on the 7th of last month and stayed until the 10th, when she was obliged to get rid of her as she had no money, and the witness could not afford to keep her. She owed the witness 12 shillings. When the witness asked for payment, she said her husband would pay. Her husband came on the second day and told the witness to look after his wife, and he promised to call again the next day, but he did not come. A letter arrived addressed to Mrs. Rudd the day after the prisoner had left. The witness now handed the letter to the prisoner, who put it in her pocket unopened. The clerk said the prisoner was quite justified in saying she was expecting a letter from her husband, and one actually came. No doubt she was a source of trouble to her husband, as only a few weeks ago she was before that court, having been turned out of the Queen's Hotel in Upper Norwood. On that occasion her husband paid the fine. The chairman said that the only false pretence alleged against the prisoner so far was the statement that her husband was following on a bicycle, but there was nothing to show that that statement was incorrect. As a matter of fact, he was in her company at Brighton, and so she was discharged. The prisoner left the dock looking very pleased at the result of the case. The Croydon Times version describes Mary Smith and Mrs. Edward Rudd as, quote, a masculine-looking woman of about 36. Remember that drunk lady doctor was also described in this way? And reputed to be a doctor of medicine. as far as the conclusion of the court came to, they say, Mr. Seal remarked that no doubt prisoner's husband had had a great trouble. He recollected, however, that when the accused was fined for drunkenness at that court some weeks since, Mr. Rudd paid the penalty. He supposed he had lost all patience with her. And it goes on, Mrs. Smith then left the court with 2 lady friends, her husband previously declaring that he washed his hands of her henceforth. Comment that her husband was a South African barrister, although not quite accurate, it could describe an agent at law, which is the profession Edward Augustus Rudd gave in all the baptisms of his children with his first wife. Now, I'm curious that Mrs. Rudd knew the New South Wales Agent General in London by name. Sir Saul Samuel, who was Agent General of New South Wales in London between the years of 1880 and 1897. Where did she get this information from? And who is she really? Is she Mary Smith, as the police said, or Francis Rudd, born Dick, or Dr. Francis Dick, or who? At this point, the one thing I hadn't found yet was her death. Perhaps that would unlock some more clues. And searching through the death registers in Southampton, where Edward and Emily lived, I found on the General Registration Office site this information. Emily Beatrice Gullick Rudd, age 76, died March quarter 1941. The year of birth more or less matches up, as do the first names, Emily Beatrice, and the surname, Rudd, except for this new one, which is Gullick. Where did that come from? It looks more like a surname or a family name. Or perhaps that is her real maiden name. It wasn't Dick at all. A search for the births in Radstock, or its registration district, which, as I said, is Clutton in Somerset, produced this. Gullick, Emily Beatrice Mary, mother's maiden name Lawrence, born in the June quarter 1864, and baptized, as you can see, that same year. What happened between 1864 and 1897 when she married Edward Rudd? I found an entry in the St. Pancras Workhouse admissions for 1869 when Emily would have been 5 years old. As you can see here, there's Emily, who's 33, which is her mother. There's Emily, who's 5, and her sister Elizabeth. I then found 2 census records, 1871 when she was 6 years old, when she was still at home with her parents, and 1881 when she was 16 years old. By 1881, she had moved to London and was working as a housemaid for Francis G.P. Nyson. Although it lists his occupation as barrister at law, in fact, he was a world-renowned and published author of mathematical statistician. And it says she was born in Camerton, Somerset. Well, Camerton is one of the little villages which makes up the Clutton registration district in Somerset. I couldn't find any reference to Emily Beatrice Gullick in the 1891 census. I wonder which name she was occupying at that point. And so my conclusions. Emily Beatrice Gullick was born in 1864, was the daughter of a Somerset coal miner. Before she was 16 years old, she made her way to London and worked as a housemaid in the home of Francis G.P. Nyson. Sometime between 1881 and 1895, she most probably worked as a housemaid in a boarding house where, in the early 1890s, perhaps Dr. Francis Dick who was one of the first women doctors in Australia, was boarding, having just completed her degree. By the time Emily had left for Cape Town, she had adopted the identity of Dr. Francis Dick, perhaps stealing from her or from other guests in the boarding house so that she could afford a ticket to Cape Town. Here she met Edward Augustus Rudd. While in Cape Town, the owner of the hotel in Loop Street or Long Street, Mr. Edward Foley, said she had done nothing since her arrival. She did not work, only drank. In 1896, she returned to London, and perhaps her drinking continued, so that she was so drunk in November 1896 that she was arrested and fined 10 shillings, and gave her name as the identity she had stolen, Dr. Francis Dick. In February 1897, she married Edward Augustus Rudd in Pancras Registration District, London, still giving herself the name Frances Mary Lily Dick. It seems they went down to Brighton, and from there she seemed to have headed back to London and the suburbs around Croydon and Norwood. Here again she was arrested for being unable to pay her hotel bill. In Norwood, Edward was able to step in and pay, but in Croydon he wasn't, and she'd been taken into custody. It appears that on her journey to London she stayed in workhouses as she made her way from Brighton to London. In her trial in Croydon, she once again used the identity of Dr. Francis Dick and included some accurate details of the Australian officials in London. I believe that she was mostly suffering from some alcohol-induced mental illness. As the news report says, her husband, Edward Rudd, did not wish to give evidence. His position was a very painful one. One article also ended saying her husband previously declaring that he washed his hands of her henceforth. But they must have come together again, having a child in 1901, and they remained together until her death in 1941. And her husband died in 1947. And although her case was dismissed, it must have been hard for Mr. Edward Rudd. No further evidence of Emily Rudd's drinking or mental illness was found from that point onwards. However, some questions still arise. Did Edward Rudd still think her name was Frances Dick when he married her? Why was he happy to see her change her name to Emily Beatrice Dick from 1901 onwards? Had he by then found out the whole truth? Was Edward Rudd in on the whole deception from point one? Was the constant lying about their age on census forms, etc., attempts to hide the truth? Why suddenly give her real place of birth in 1921, and on her death, why does her real name appear? Gaelic. Or was she really Dr. Francis Dick, a doctor with an alcohol-induced mental illness and amnesia? Thank you very much, and a special thank you to Jane Stewart Clark, whose great-grandfather this is, and for allowing me permission to use the story here today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them to this video. Thank you.